Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website and those who will be joining us via C-SPAN television networks in the future. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as we prepare to begin. And of course, for those watching online now and in the future, you are welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference as well. Leading our discussion today is James Gattuso, Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy in Heritage's Institute for Economic Freedom. He handles telecommunications and regulatory issues. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, he was Vice President for Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He has served as Vice President for Policy Development with Citizens for Sound Economy, also as Deputy Chief of the Office of Plans and Policy at the FCC, and was at one time Associate Director of the President's Council on Competitiveness in the Office of Vice President Dan Quayle. Please join me in welcoming James Gattuso. James?
Thanks. I'll just speak from here. You get a more casual approach here. We are here to talk about spectrum policy today. If you want to talk about net neutrality, you're in the wrong place. This is probably the only gathering of people today that are coming together to talk about FCC issues that are not talking about net neutrality, but we'll see that as a good thing. It's hard to believe that just a few decades ago, spectrum in the United States, in fact around the world, was one of the most constrained resources on Earth. Every detail of the use of radio frequencies was dictated by the FCC or directly by the U.S. government. You had taxi radios allocated by the FCC, railroad signaling allocated by the FCC, firefighters, forest firefighters, their walkie-talkies regulated by the FCC. In fact, at one time, it was commonplace to see unused firefighting frequencies in Manhattan, while there are unused taxi radio frequencies in Wyoming. That's what we learned to live with. In addition to the inefficiencies of the system, it was abused. The system limited competition intentionally and subjected its licensees to political interference, as hard as that is to believe. Can you spell fairness doctrine? Now, today the system has been freed from this, frankly, Soviet-like system. Spectrum today is largely, put that in capital letters, bold, largely allowed to be used as markets direct, resulting in billions in gains for consumers, perhaps trillions. Now, it has been the largest and most successful privatization in U.S. history. And think about that. When I first came to the Heritage Foundation, I was working on transportation issues, and the sale of Conrail was the big privatization item on the agenda. That raised about $1.7 billion, I think. That is nothing compared to what was achieved in spectrum. And remarkably, this revolution in public policy, which is so rare in Washington, I mean, nothing gets done for something this big to go through, was achieved with relatively little partisan acrimony. There is acrimony between different industries, between us, but it was largely was not partisan. This was something that was flexibility, liberalization of spectrum went through in Democratic and Republican administrations both. Now, our speaker today has written a book on all this, so he actually knows about the things I'm raising here. Most of what I know comes from Tom anyway. He will give a remarks about 20 minutes, and then we have a couple of commenters who will correct what he said afterwards. But let me just introduce Tom. For those of you who don't know him, he is Currently holds the H.H. Macaulay Endowed Chair in Economics at Clemson University. Before that, he was at George Mason University, Wharton School, American Enterprise Institute, all following telecommunications and spectrum policy. And he also served as chief economist of the Federal Communications Commission, which was the highlight of his career. Just as an aside, since I've gone off script already, I still remember when he was first appointed. I was working for Pepper over there. He said that the chairman, who was Al Sykes, a good conservative, but not wanted to take things one step at a time. He said, "Has Tom written anything that would be embarrassing?" and you passed on that question. I thought, my God, has he written anything that's not embarrassing? And we went through every one of his op-eds for the 2 years. And I don't know how he got through, but it was one of the, I count that as one of the major accomplishments of my short career at the FCC. So with that as a background, let me turn it over to Tom Haslund.
Thank you very much, James, and I do fondly recall working with you at the FCC, with Bob Pepper, with Evan Correll, and I'm delighted that Heritage has invited me here today and invited that some of you could be here. I am a professor now at Clemson University, and so I must start with a shout out to Clemson University. This is last January. In case you missed it, go Tigers. I did live here for 15 years until 2014, so we've gotten lucky on the sports front, and it is great being at a fun school. But in my spare time, I'm not worried about the football team. I have been working on this book, The Political Spectrum. I hope you get a chance to buy it and read it in reverse order, if you will. But it is actually officially published on May 23rd. Going this way? Oops. There we go. I see, it was a little sticky. Okay, so in brief, what we're going to talk about today, Herbert Hoover and the 1927 Radio Act. Don't get too excited. The vast wasteland. The price system, as suggested by an economist, Ronald Coase, not taken too seriously at the outset. Then something called the toaster model, and the liberalization that came after that. And then I'm going to give a little story from the book. It's sort of in parts in the book about gentlemen who were on the innovative front, Edwin Howard Armstrong and Steve Jobs, who I assume most of you know. Finally, I'll finish with a little plea looking towards the future. More spectrum, please. So, the story on radio spectrum starts in about 1895, when two radios were put together by an inventor over in England, and communications took place over some distance. And the radio was here, and not too much happened. There were applications, certainly, and in World War I, radio became an important application and of some interest. In the marketplace, however, there wasn't a lot of reason to be concerned about wireless because there were very few radios and very little interference that would take place one user versus another. That starts to change, and quickly, in 1920, when a radio station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania decides to blast out at high power over an entire area, broadcasting, trying to hit thousands, if not more, receivers. And it wasn't point-to-point anymore to communicate, say, from ship to shore. Now radio became what the stations hoped was a mass media service. And that change in business model really changed everything. And there were conflicts. the transmissions of one station could make it more difficult for the listeners to another station to conduct their business, to hear the signals they wanted to hear. And there has been a lot of commentary over the years and even 100 years later about what was called, I love this phrase from the United States Navy, etheric bedlam. It was thought that there was a gaseous substance, ether, through which these signals traveled. Turns out signals just go through dead space. They don't need atmosphere. But anyway, etheric bedlam was the phrase chosen to say that there was chaos. And in fact, there came to be a very standard view of what developed in the marketplace and in the 1920s U.S. Radio broadcasting world, and it comes from, most notably, the United States Supreme Court. I call this myth calculation because there was a stylized set of facts put together, and they can be captured here in the Supreme Court decision. Before 1927, said the court, the allocation of frequencies was left entirely to the private sector, and the result was chaos. Without government control, the medium would be of little use because of the cacophony of competing voices. So one of the things I like about that is that the United States Supreme Court misspelled cacophony. But there was more wrong. It was pre-spell check, so I guess you have to give them a break on that. But there was more wrong than just the spelling. In fact, what actually happens in the 1920s, prior to the 27 Radio Act, is a very robust market in the new technology. And there are rules of the road. There is not generic, etheric bedlam. The rules of the road are enforced by Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce. And he had authority under a 1912 Radio Act to minimize interference, and in fact, the department used what was a very standard technique in common law, priority in use, to say that when a broadcaster had an established service, that encroachment from others would be stopped. And so just on that simple set of rules, a burgeoning market develops. And in fact, by 1926, this is all pre-1927 Radio Act, there are about 5 million U.S. radio households. Now, these are households that are buying radio consoles, not these little sets or receiver chips that we know today. These are multi-$100 sets in current dollars. These are very expensive investments, but there is a craze, and radio is part of it. I just have a couple of, I could show you the numbers of sales and so forth, but this is better. Art Deco covers from Radio News Magazine, and you can see that it's already entered the world of romance, and by 1926, things are already starting to fall apart in the social scheme of things. This actually looks like a very contemporary situation where on the wedding night, the newly married couple is now apparently on their honeymoon, and she is already crying because he is preoccupied with his radio. So you look at this and you go, well, we've made a lot of progress over 90 years. We now have gender equity, and maybe today he would be as likely to be crying because she's on her phone. But this was the world of radio, already developing quickly and impressively in the pre-regulation era. Well, what happens? The system was working, and in fact, it worked too well for Herbert Hoover. Hoover was a very entrepreneurial and intelligent government official. He had been one of the most successful engineers in the early part of the century and had famously joined government in World War I on the Belgian relief effort and became prized for his skill and efficiency. He also knew a lot about the emerging radio technology, and in fact, the rules he put into place were very effective in developing sponsoring development of the industry. But as a regulator, Hoover made it quite clear he didn't care about limiting interference. He wanted more jurisdiction, more authority to determine actually not just how markets develop, but who got to broadcast and what they said. And this was a very popular view amongst other policymakers, Republicans and Democrats alike, wanted this obviously influential medium of public opinion to have some regulatory component that could be influenced from Washington. Now, at the same time, the industry, as it was developing, exhibited some pronounced, in hindsight, standard elements of what has come to be known industry capture. That is to say, they wanted protection. These are the major commercial radio stations that pop up and become successful early on in broadcasting. They wanted protection from entry. And they thought that the first come, first serve rules were fine for what was going on then, but of course that could invite new entry on new bands as this industry extended. So strategically, Hoover at the Commerce Department stopped enforcing these priority and use rules. And this actually occurs on a particular day where he puts out a press announcement saying that there will be no more enforcement, and that does invite entry of a couple hundred stations. There were about 550 stations, and 200 more very quickly enter the market. There is a lot of moving around amongst the stations, and there is some complaint now. In fact, they call it at the time the period of the breakdown of the law. There had been law, now there was an elimination of that law through this enforcement withdrawal at the Department of Commerce. And so you do get some, what the Navy might call etheric bedlam. Now, it could be fixed, of course, by restoring the law in various means, either through court litigation or, of course, by a statute that revisited the question and established rules of the road, even adopted the mechanism that had already been in place. In fact, during the period of the breakdown of the law, this is September, November of 1926, there is a court case in the state of Illinois, and it's not the top headline there. This is the next headline: Court fixes radio rights in air. WGN wins. So WGN, which was owned by the Chicago Tribune, and this is a headline from that paper in November of 1926, actually goes to court because an interloper during the breakdown period, when Commerce is not enforcing the rules, an interloper comes in and starts moves their frequency assignment and broadcasts, in WGN's eyes, too close and interferes with WGN's audience. By the way, WGN, owned by the Chicago Tribune, WGN means world's greatest newspaper. So they go to court. A judge, Cook County judge, gets this case. First impression. Reviews radio development, radio law, analogizes it to water rights in the West, and you've got a scarce resource that he says, well, might be pioneered or homesteaded by certain users, and under the common law doctrine, priority and use, awards WGN a property right. That's what you're seeing here being reported on in the newspaper. By the way, I do think it's charming that if you go back 100 years in a Chicago newspaper and pick out a front page, it's not unlikely that you'll have a top headline that'll have something to do with indicting a municipal official. So, so there you have it. But the other story there is quite impressive. And it did impress people at the time. Aerial property rights defined for the first time. A court has declared yesterday property rights may be created, and it goes on and so forth. That's called the Oak Leaves case. Congress takes it seriously. The decision is not published in Illinois, but it is published in the Senate records, December 10th, 1926. There is some urgency during this period, and this adds to it. The House and Senate, after years of bickering about what the new regulation should look like, they get together, they compromise, and they create the Federal Radio Commission with the Radio Act, February 23rd, 1927, the brainchild of Herbert Hoover and signed into law by President Coolidge. Since that day, we have had what I would call the political spectrum. That is to say, there is a public interest standard for allocating radio waves. It's administrative allocation, and the explicit nature of the program is that markets really can't do this job. Government has to plan out what people do with radio spectrum, and they have to plan it in the public interest, a very vague standard that can mean many things to many administrations. And anybody with a new radio technology has to ask for permission and get radio spectrum rights assigned specifically for that task. This has been called Mother May I by multiple chairs of the Federal Communications Commission. And I should say we got the Federal Radio Act in 1927. That created the Federal Radio Commission in 1934. On the wireless side, we just carried forward but renamed the commission the Federal Communications Commission. And we have that regime 90 years later as we stand here today. Immediately, there's output restriction on the market. The incumbent commercial stations are delighted for the next few years. There are many small stations, and many of them are owned by nonprofit organizations. They're knocked off the air. The major broadcasters, the commercial enterprises, they do very well. And ever since, we've had this very protectionist system where new technologies have had to pass the Mother May I test with federal regulators. Incumbents typically object, and things stretch out for years or decades, and often entire new competitive opportunities are missed. And that's called silence of the entrants in the book, and we have many examples. And that's the first part of the story, okay? But there's another part to this story, because the story takes a few twists. And there are visionaries in the book, and here's one of them. A British economist who came to the U.S. named Ronald Coase started nosing around this marketplace in the 1950s, and he thought these arguments given for why we have this special central allocation regime just didn't make a lot of sense. Yes, access to radio spectrum may be a scarce right or resource, but we have a lot of other things that are scarce, and they're assigned by prices through competitive markets, and it seems to work pretty well. Why not this? Well, it wasn't clear to Coase that markets would work. There are transaction costs. Sometimes there are special difficulties in using different types of resources. But he saw that there was a lot of imperfections in the existing system, a lot of Mother May I, a lot of inefficiencies that resulted from competition that didn't take place. And so he advocated at least a test where we would have private ownership in frequencies, and we would distribute the rights by auction to competitive bidders, and we would allow simple marketplace transactions, what he called the price system, to allocate radio spectrum. Well, this idea was mocked and savaged by the experts and by the establishment, by the regulators. Said it was, you know, they said, when Coase testified at the Federal Communications Commission about 1959, the first question, "Tell us, Professor, are you spoofing us? Is this all a big joke?" Then they awarded him a Nobel Prize in economics, sort of make up for it, and that was nice. One of the nice things about Coase is that he lives to be 102 years old, and he sees a lot change in the world. So if you're going to be castigated and treated with ridicule early in your career, that's my suggestion. Live a long time and see if it turns out better. And Coase did. He passed away in 2013. And along the way, Coase got to see markets take his suggestion. Now, it wasn't that people said, oh yeah, Coase is right, but there are a lot of factors that drove this, and certainly his enunciation of an alternative regime was among them. Most particularly, we got away from Mother May I, where we had a world in which everything done through wireless needed a specific authorization. We went to much more generic licenses, which are de facto property rights, where we allow private parties to figure out what their own networks are, what devices use those networks, and how interference is going to work between the users. We, in essence, delegated all this complexity about how to coordinate economic activity to competitors in the marketplace. We got rid of that in particular parts of the wireless world, particular frequencies, particular bands, not generically. It's a very limited project, but we now have, on very important slices of radio spectrum, proof of concept that the Coasean notion works pretty well, and the rules are available to us to move forward, and we have examples to prove it. And we'll do that with a tale of two technologies. Meet Professor Edwin Howard Armstrong. He preferred actually to go by the name of Colonel because he did serve in the U.S. military in both World Wars. He was a brilliant young student at Columbia in the early days of the century. He literally graduated and was immediately added to the faculty to teach physics. Here's a picture of him in 1922. As a professor at Columbia, he opted out of taking a salary. He didn't want to be on committees. And he was the largest shareholder in the RCA, Radio Corporation of America, in the 1920s with his patents. So he decided to work for $1 a year, use the laboratories, use the graduate students, and do his research. And it was a good deal for both parties. Anyway, I love this picture, which is in the book. The world's first boombox he invents and gives to his bride in 1923. That just has to be cool. It's also cool that he's wearing a suit on the beach. So he comes up with a brilliant idea. In 1933-34, he basically develops an entirely new way to send sound signals. AM was the established technology, and he had a way to send crystal clear signals much farther and more effectively with better reception. And he went to the Federal Communications Commission, Mother May I. And the first reaction of the FCC was to check with their experts, most of whom worked for RCA. And they were told by the experts it really didn't work. And that took a while to get over. And he finally was given an allocation for this system and some experimental licenses in the later years of the 1930s. And by 1940-41, there were about 400,000 users of FM radio in the United States. People who had gone out and bought those big, now FM radio consoles, 400,000. Now World War II comes. Colonel Armstrong goes back into the U.S. Army to do radio, as he had done in World War I. And all civilian production stops. When the war is ending, the Federal Communications Commission comes back and takes another look at this band that they've allocated for FM. Well, by the way, the service got rave reviews. And this was really anticipated to take off after World War II as a civilian technology that was very popular with high-fidelity broadcasting. Well, the FCC decided, no, we're going to move this band over the vociferous objections of Edwin Howard Armstrong and the expert testimony of many government experts. The Federal Communications Commission ripped the existing allocation, 42 to 50 megahertz, out of FM radio broadcasting, rendering every single one of those radio receivers obsolete, all the towers, all the technology, and then placed FM where it is today, 88 to 108 megahertz. And Edwin Howard Armstrong fought this. He was depressed and despondent, and to a large extent, the reason that he committed suicide in 1954 was over the exclusion of his technology, almost the murder of his technology by the Federal Communications Commission allocation system. Sadly or happily, however you want to look at it, in the 1960s, FM was finally unleashed through regulation to really take a fair shot head-to-head with AM. Of course, in just a small number of years, FM totally eclipses AM. Its quality is outstanding compared to AM transmissions, and it goes farther and better. And next time you're in a big hotel somewhere and you can get AM, FM, check the AM signals and see how staticky and terrible they are compared to FM, and just know to yourself that Edwin Howard Armstrong is smiling about the FCC saying his technology didn't work. Anyway, in 1966 as well, his widow received very generous $6-7 million in patent payouts from people that he had been suing, and she ended up very wealthy, and his technology ended up very nice. But unfortunately for him, he didn't live long enough to see it. Okay, now this I'll make a little bit of a little bit more out of this. So this was a dead zone until the 1960s. The FM band, by the way, this radio, I don't know if you see it very well, but it says FM 42 to 50. Okay, that's not the current allocation. That's the dead zone. That's a 1941 radio. And there were dead zones everywhere, okay, not just in FM radio, but there was so much spectrum that could not be utilized because there were protectionist rules in place. And it was noticed particularly in television, where a fourth national network existing, again, on experimental licenses in the 1940s, Dumont was actually killed off by the TV allocation table of 1952, and we were just left with 3 national competitors. And regulators saw the problem. The most famous speech ever given by any U.S. regulator was May 9th, 1961, when the regulator in Washington said, this is a vast wasteland. Television is getting all this valuable right to broadcast, but they're not doing anything with it. It's a mess. The senseless sitcoms, the violent westerns, this is all boring, and the commercials are worse. The chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Newton Minow, blasted the executives of the broadcasting industry and said, I'm going to be the cop on the beat. I am going to hold your feet to the fire, and when I go back to Washington, I'm going to take a good hard look at all these renewals. In fact, we're going to have new forms. New forms for the renewals will be tough and ask you what you're doing for the public interest. Now, Minow was hailed as a prophet. He was not very popular in the room with the broadcasters. In fact, the broadcasters, the CBS show Gilligan's Island, took a shot at Minow by having the lost shipwreck be called the SS Minnow, spelled slightly differently. In 1964, I think it debuted. But outside the hall, now this was a very popular thing to do, to say that the broadcasters were really going to be regulated in a new way. But there were no new forms. Okay, nothing happened, except something did happen. In fact, the Minnow FCC immediately did something extraordinary in changing policy to oppose emerging cable television. A new platform was coming up trying to compete head-to-head, and it was blocked for a solid 15 years. Until the deregulation wave of the late 1970s, cable was actually held in check. And all the public affairs programming we have today, essentially, from C-SPAN to CNN to Fox News, MSNBC, Bloomberg, Al Jazeera, Vice, anything else that comes in and out, plus the documentaries and all the other entertainment programming, sports, weather, all that stuff, all that competition, completely now dominating the television video market. In fact, it's being challenged by the next generation of unregulated television, not the old broadcast terrestrial public interest licensing, but over-the-top television. This is what was blocked, okay, bottled up by regulation. And in fact, before this could be unleashed, a new idea had to come to market. And this is perhaps the most vilified speech or comment ever given by at least a Federal Communications Commission chair. It comes in 1981 when the Reagan appointee, Mark Fowler, head of the FCC, gives an interview to a magazine, Reason magazine, and says, television is just another appliance. It's a toaster with pictures. And what he means by that is we're going to regulate television just as another product. We want competition to do the work. We're not going to describe what the product has to be. And we're going to let consumers do the choosing. And that, to this day, gets negative citations, including in 2012 on Jeopardy. This was Mad Men for 800. The answer is, in the 1980s growing broadcast empires, in the 80s, growing broadcast empires had help from the mad monk of deregulation, Mark Fowler of this commission. Please put your answer in the form of a question. So, what finally happens, scrolling quickly through this, is that the toaster idea, minimalist regulation, let competition do the work. The regulators should support competition and then get out of the way. That comes roaring in the late 70s, early 80s with cable deregulation, and then, which was ancillary to wireless. And then in wireless, we got cellular in the 80s, much more liberal forms of competition. And by the way, it was introduced with two competitors. That was extraordinarily radical at the time. Two head-to-head competitors in the phone market, wireless phone. Then we actually end technology mandates for wireless in 1988. This is in the US. In 1993, we authorized through congressional statute license auctions. And then we have liberal licenses that come into the markets, clearly established by the middle 1990s. And each carrier now is their own sort of miniature FCC. They get to determine what radios, what networks, what services, what applications use their space. And there's some politics of broadcasting being different than cellular, and we can maybe go into that later, but it's clear that in the United States, and in fact around the world, almost everywhere, the regulation of cellular mobile markets is decidedly more liberal than the regulation of broadcasting. And so the last 30 years, when mobile has come into the market, there's been this distinct shift in the arc of regulation. When the innovator Apple decides to make a radio about 2005, and of course it would become an iconic device that has now, changed the world in its own way, it had to do what Edwin Howard Armstrong had to do in 1934. It had to find radio spectrum for the radio. But the world had changed. And when Steve Jobs took his innovation to the market, he found that he could buy radio spectrum. In fact, there was a market, and the market was so robust and so competitive that the carriers actually paid Apple. And there's a lot to that story, but we'll just leave it at that. That got to the market, it got there quickly, And it wasn't just the device, it wasn't just the mobile network, it wasn't just the flexibility of the operations of the telecommunications, it was everything that could go with it. I mean, the world has changed because of the ecosystem, the content, the applications, and the services that now exist. We know that around the world, the radical transformation is that wireless now connects people, okay, people who lived in isolation. I mean, there's never been more than about 1 billion fixed line phones in the world, and the number's now going down. And there are a lot more people. Today, as we are here, there are over 6 billion cell phone subscribers. More people have cell phones than toothbrushes. And that has meant everything. Here's just one of my favorite applications. A Malaysian farmer goes out, holds a smartphone over a field. It records the noise, the background noise, and the app then tells the farmer what pesticides it should use, the farmer should use to best manage the crop. Okay? We know the innovation goes in amazing dimensions, in amazing depth. And that's what starts when you unleash the innovation. So this message has gotten out. There are many regulators who have caught the vision and have led much of the reform and have had to be an integral part of our progress. And there is ongoing spectrum reform. And in fact, as we are here in Washington, I would be remiss not to talk about a process that is still ongoing, but the formal bidding process took a year and just ended last month, what the Federal Communications Commission calls an incentive auction. This comes from a very interesting policy pivot. 2009-2010, the Federal Communications Commission sponsored a program, National Broadband Plan was its name, that conceded that the public interest allocation for TV had been much too large. It was time to allow that spectrum for TV, set aside the 1952 TV allocation table. The days of I Love Lucy are over. New generations of video delivery are here, cable, satellite, over the top. Let's allow the spectrum to go where it does more good. And so it devised a plan to buy back TV licenses. This is an interesting thing, that the government issues licenses, then politically is frozen, cannot, this is the political spectrum, cannot literally non-renew them and take it back and do the public interest allocation it says is needed. It needs to buy them back. And in fact, that was the right path, in my opinion, to entice cooperation from marketplace participants. And the auction that was proposed in there has taken place, as I said, just concluded last week. But the problem is we're 8 years into this program, and we still have the delays that the FCC was complaining about in 2010. And we also have a lot less spectrum. We've only taken, in fact, less than a fourth of the TV band that was existing or is existing, walled off for television, the applications from 1952, and not efficient for the way we like to get services, including video today, which is through mobile devices and other wireless connections. And so I have a little chart here that just basically says we have 49 channels walled off for over-the-air television. It's 294 megahertz if you're scoring at home. In 2010, the FCC made a target to try to unleash about 40% of that band, or 120 megahertz, and to get it out on the market by 2014, 2015. It's a good try. It's a good policy pivot, and the FCC does deserve credit for heading in this direction. It certainly has not reached its own goals, and indeed, as we stand here today, I would argue that a much more efficient way to liberalize the system is to use market incentives, which I call overlays, to allow rights to use radio spectrum that respect the existing users, in fact, grandfather all the existing TV stations, if we're talking about this particular TV band, to create new rights that can be sold to competitors in the market to reuse the spectrum in a liberal, flexible way, and that those would unleash incentives where marketplace competitors could buy out existing stations, move them around, get them to go cable and satellite or over the top. And then, in fact, the entire band, TV band, 49 channels today, it's going to be at least 35 channels in even 2 or 3 years when the FCC gets done with its current reallocation. So instead of taking 10 years to get about 12 channels freed up, I would suggest that a more market-oriented reform program could actually operate much more quickly and get the entire TV band turned around. And given the fact we've got 35 channels left, we should go ahead and move forward with that right now today. More overlays starting now. So I appreciate your attention, and I give you the closing quiz. Who doesn't belong and why? It's not a trick. We've got the inventor, Guglielmo Marconi. We've got the regulator, Herbert Hoover. And we've got the innovator, Steve Jobs. And I would suggest that the regulator in the middle doesn't belong and why, because the Mother May I system that Hoover was fond of and we have adopted has proven itself an artifact of a prehistoric regulatory era that has been surpassed by the success and opportunity that the very encouraging deregulation of mobile markets has given us today. So thank you very much, and that's it.
Your speakers back up. You mentioned Marconi. A few years ago, I went back to my family homeland, Sicily, and visiting some of my relatives there. I found they idolized Marconi in Sicily. And unfortunately, it was not because of his free market policies, but because of other political directions he had in the 1930s. But enough on that.
Well, let me just say that Marconi was a British and Italian citizen. And yes, his views politically were interesting.
I don't know what to say. Our next speaker, our first commenter is Charla.
Okay,
Rath.
great.
Just quickly in terms of background, Charla previously, currently is Vice President for Wireless Policy Development at Verizon. I held a couple other positions at Verizon, but prior to joining that company, she was Vice President at NextWave Telecom.
Mentioned in the book.
And at Freedom Technologies, which is an application company given our theme today. Before that, she worked as an aide to Chairman Al Sykes at the FCC and at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. So Charlotte Rath.
Great, thank you. Professor Hazlett, the answer is overlays, right? Read the book, you'll get the joke. As always, it's actually a pleasure to read what Tom writes, and it's, and actually I had to show, because it looks like I didn't read this, right? But I actually read it on a Kindle, so I just wanted to show you that I had, that's how many notes and that I did make to it, because I found that I was constantly underlining, I was writing notes, I'm like, is this quite right? I don't remember it this way, but generally, not too many of those kinds of notes. It's, needless to say, great one-liners, great quotes, the best stories, but ultimately it's impeccably researched with, just a fabulous collection of footnotes that would probably take me about a decade to go through and read, but I have read some of them. I actually think I've written a few of them, but not as many as, the other people who are sitting at the table. So I do appreciate, James, you inviting me to be here, particularly because it is a little bit overwhelming for me to be among, people that I consider to be scholars in this industry. And I'm, I work for a wireless carrier. So in any event, what is interesting for me reading this is most of my career has actually been focused on mobile wireless. And it's always interesting for me because a good portion of the front part of this book is actually the history of spectrum allocation, which I sort of consider it a little bit for me like, to those of you who remember this, studying geometry, you learn theorems. You'd learn them once and then you got to forget them because you just used the product of that theorem to then go through and deal with the rest of your life. So in a way, I felt like what I was doing with reading Tom's book was going back and relearning my geometry theorems and remembering, what it was about, how we got to where we were. To me, it's also kind of a fascinating shift of the primacy of broadcast to the primacy of mobile communications. And I realize I work for a mobile company, and that may be the reason I'm saying that, but I would suggest that, no, it's really because all of you sitting in front of me you probably are on your mobile device much more often than you're sitting in front of a television watching broadcast television. It's just a change that's taken place, and it's in large part, because of a lot of the things that Tom outlines in his book. And I also have to laugh because he talks about and one of the things he talks about in his book is really what I remember is my first time that I was actually aware that the federal government had some control over television, which of course was George Carlin's 7 words you're never allowed to say on television. And we actually, as a kid, we used to play that record in our lounge at my all-girls Catholic high school. So it is, and it really was. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I'm not allowed to say these words at home, but, that's parental regulation. I didn't realize that, in fact, there was this agency that regulated speech in the broadcast world. So my world in mobile began almost 30 years ago at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And it was interesting, at that point, Al Sykes, who later became chairman of the FCC, was still head of NTIA, and had us start work on UHF taboos. And actually, Tom mentions the taboos in the book, but he doesn't actually go on to explain, they're just talking about the moments as like white space because of the way the broadcasting allocation table was designed. But in fact, in the UHF band, it was even worse than just, having to separate distance. There were problems that had to do with the manufacturer of receivers that didn't allow you to actually use spectrum. You had to separate by 6 channels in the UHF band. And so I was asked to head up a project, to look at this and see whether there was, what were the constraints, how could you actually do something that could, in fact, free up this spectrum. Well, when there was a change of the head of NTIA to Janice Obuchowski, that paper actually morphed into a larger study that is also quoted in the book. It's U.S. Spectrum Managed Policy and Agenda for the Future, which actually, interestingly, did talk about almost everything that Tom talked about in his book, but it was actually prior to auctions being adopted. At that point, flexibility had sort of begun. In particular, and actually I have my notes, but I'm going to sort of go forward a little bit because it fits here, but particularly in 1988 when the Commission adopted the digital cellular ruling, and Tom alludes to that as sort of, and mentioned it in his slides as kind of the way forward, but I actually feel like that deserves almost a chapter in and of itself, because when that happened, if you understand our industry, the cellular industry to begin with, there was a government standard in the beginning, and that was an analog standard. In 1988, the Commission made what was a brave and actually astounding decision and said, you know what? We will not make the right decision if we choose the digital standard. So basically, we're going to leave it up to the companies to do that. And, they were right. To quote a former FCC official, and in fact, maybe even sitting here, but I doubt it, there were other people who said this. I think it was the chief scientist at the time who said, if we had chosen the standard, we would have actually chosen the wrong one. And so what happened in the U.S. as a result, some people looked at as being a mistake, which we had 2 standards. One was the standard that was promulgated throughout the rest of the world. The other was this little standard called CDMA, which, by the way, then became the basis for most of the standards in the 3G world after that. So it's sort of an interesting thing that also what that did is it led to our ability as carriers to just say, you know what, we see a need to move to the next generation of technology. We see a demand in the market. We want to do things a little bit differently. Combining that, what I consider to be a very critical decision, along with the liberalization and the types of things that Tom was talking about, I think really did lead to the incredible market that we have here today. The other interesting thing too, and this is probably just a little bit of a thing that I disagreed with. You characterize cellular as being, liberal, but in fact, the cellular rules only recently were updated by the federal government, by the FCC, to actually permit us to do some of the things that have been permitted for the last 20 years in PCS, including we, up until then, did not have geographic licenses. There was this sort of sense you had a geographic license, but you still had to report at the edges of your geographic license when you would make changes. And PCS, when it came on, the commission just said, look, this is what we're selling you. And, if you have problems at the edges of your licenses, just, negotiate it with your neighbor. And all of that worked really well, but it took almost 20 years for the FCC to catch up the other service. And I know you don't want me to talk much longer on this, but there are just a couple of other things that I'd like to just add. To me, the interesting thing was, too, is if you remember back in that era when PCS was being adopted, a couple of comments on that. One is you, in the book, talk about the stars being aligned, which is really, in a large way, what led to auctions being adopted. I think the PCS that, coming in 1989, and there was this interesting thing where not the rest of the world, but the Europeans were actually doing PCS on spectrum that was currently held by the federal government. So there was a little bit going on in NTIA where it gave them sort of, okay, the quid pro quo, you're after our spectrum here, you want more spectrum from the government. What we want you to do, Congress, is we actually want you to adopt auctions. And so both Al Sykes at the FCC and Janice Obuchowski at the NTIA took this on as a fight. And I think it had been mentioned many times before, but I don't think anybody said, okay, we're going to take this on as a fight and really get this adopted. The irony is, of course, it actually wasn't adopted until there was a centrist Democratic president, and with an OMB that really wanted money. So, I mean, all of those things have been in place before, but I think it worked out in an interesting way. At the time, Wall Street, as well as a lot of consultants to my predecessor companies, were saying that this was going to be a horrible mistake to have all this spectrum out here. So the bottom line, and this gets to the end of my remarks, the bottom line is that was not a huge mistake. It turned out to be one of the best decisions the commission could have ever made in terms of releasing more spectrum. They continue to try and release more spectrum. We are firm believers. I actually, looking at the tail end of Tom's book, he actually outlines a number of reforms that he thinks should take place. And these are am I mistaken, Tom? I don't think any of them are really new ideas, but it's just a matter of there's still more room for us to do things. And at the top of the list, in my list, it's, just get more spectrum out there. It used to be we didn't like more spectrum because that might mean more competitors, but that has actually in large part changed. We just like the idea of there being enough spectrum out there that the government isn't always looking at us saying you have too much. So there's that. Overlays are important. I think you're right that the incentive auction, could that authority could be used by the FCC to free up more spectrum. I firmly believe, and I've had discussions about this with different people here, that the commission should also look at liberalizing more, just little pieces of spectrum that are all over. There are all sorts of stories about people who tried to do things and they couldn't do it because the rules wouldn't allow them to do this. So you have to go back to the commission to get the rules changed. There ought to be a way to fix that. So just before closing, there are a couple of just little notes that I wanted, mentions I wanted to make. There are two people who are not mentioned in your book who passed away recently that I just, for the record, want to mention. Kevin Kelly is one who actually was critical back in the early 80s in terms of mobile services and getting cellular adopted. And then Wayne Shelley, who you mentioned, the Washington Post book, Washington Post as being one of the first investors in the non-wireline, but it was Wayne Shelley who did it on the non-wireline and cellular, and then was the first PCS licensee to launch 23 years ago. So, both of them recently passed away. They were both, entrepreneurial. And actually, I should mention, too, Kevin later went on to work for Qualcomm and was the CDMA evangelist for many years, and a very important person in this range. So I have a lot of other things to say, but I'll stop now because I know I want to give Pepper a chance to make his comments.
Our next speaker, Robert Pepper. Robert is heads up global connection policy.
Yeah,
Connectivity policy. Sorry, I scribbled it in my notes down here and did that too quickly. At Facebook, excuse me. Previously to join Facebook, he was VP for global tech policy at Cisco. And previous to that, I believe you were at the FCC for 15 years?
20 at the commission.
And how many years at NTIA?
Yeah, before that.
It went by quickly. Pepper was the chief policy advisor to the chairman and head of the Office of Plans and Policy for 20 years. And after getting over your initial mistake of hiring me as your deputy, he was an amazing career as the advisor to both Democratic and Republican chairman of the FCC, and really the only person I know who could carry on a technical level discussion of any aspect of the FCC area. He does have a Bachelor of Arts degree and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in communications, and thus is actually to be called Dr. Pepper.
10, 2, and 4. Thank you, James. It's great to be here and actually with bringing back sort of what I think of as the dream team, right? So, but that also includes Evan Carell and John Williams, who's not in the room. I mean, it was an amazing time when we actually began to institute some of these changes. By the way, the whole notion of having a book about spectrum that is fun and makes you laugh is almost an oxymoron. So, Tom, kudos to you for really not an easy read, a fun read. So it's beyond easy and incredibly informative, and I think extraordinarily important. So some of the, and we can have sort of the discussion. So some of the big takeaways. It was, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Charlotte, a period in time where things came together, where there really was this dream team, and all of the stars were in alignment. And moving away from the command and control, mother may I, to a much more market-based approach to spectrum. Spectrum management, which of course the whole notion of no longer having mother may I and then having spectrum management is almost an oxymoron. So there were three, I think, if we take a look at lessons learned, and at the end of the book, so what is it that we've learned? I think there's three fundamental lessons. When people ask me about what is good spectrum policy, in my current role, I say there's really three components of good spectrum policy: flexibility, flexibility, and flexibility. Flexibility in technology and technology decisions. We've already heard about that, and I'll come back to that, but it's really important. Standards tend to be used as barriers to entry. Protectionism. I mean, we had, Tom talked about FM. Charlotte talked about some of the mobile wireless standards. Sort of AMPS was a requirement. We migrated away from that. Then, as the rest of the world was requiring GSM standard, we provided some flexibility. I remember when Andy Viterbi and Erwin Jacobs came in from Qualcomm with this, crazy idea of CDMA as a different way of thinking, just like Armstrong wanted frequency modulation instead of amplitude modulation, moving away from time division, multiplexing to, code. It's pretty crazy. We said, sure, we're not going to prevent you from trying, right? We'll let you take the risk. If you can convince some crazy operator that has spectrum that wants to do that, terrific, but it's about risk-taking. And that's flexibility in technology. The second type of flexibility is the definition of service, right? When we did the PCS auctions or licensing, we base it because we were taking spectrum back from and migrating the electric utility users. In fact, that almost did not happen because Senator Hollings from South Carolina had been convinced by the electric utilities in South Carolina that literally if the FCC allowed for this migration of spectrum, the lights were going to go off in South Carolina. So, and everything was going to go dark. So we had to actually deal with that. But basically, we said you can do whatever you want, and we did this also with the reclaimed spectrum later, when we reclaimed the spectrum from the TV band that Tom talked about. We said you can do anything you want in that case except for broadcasting, because it had been broadcasting, and also to allow basically any service. So there was no service definition. And then the third type of flexibility is the transferability of the licenses. And this goes back to a really important decision in the radio days, going back to the 1940s, where the FCC tried to restrict who a broadcaster could transfer their radio license to. And basically, the commission was slapped and said, no, you can't limit that. And if you think about those three forms of flexibility and the, over time beginning to introduce this, increased flexibility and license definition and service definition, and even some very, very clever, usually former FCC people who actually understood how to navigate this process. The people, Morgan O'Brien, who bought up a lot of these little, not taxi, but, fleet operations, came to the FCC and said, oh, we're putting these together. Could we interconnect into the public network for people to terminate calls, right? We knew what was going on, and we said, yeah, sure. Right? And this was about the same time that Evan and John wrote a really seminal paper asking the following thought exercise question. What would the net consumer welfare gain be if we took one 6 megahertz TV station in Los Angeles and allowed whoever got that license to provide effectively a cell phone service, right? This was a huge number. It was about $1 billion in consumer welfare gain, consumer surplus. And by the way, that was when Sykes was chairman, and James was there as deputy, and Evans in the Office of Plans and Policy. Tom is our chief economist, and that was a pretty radical question to ask. And a really interesting thing happened. We thought that the broadcasters would scream bloody murder when we published this work as an Office of Plans and Policy working paper, which had the advantage of, with a paper series historically, represented the view signed by, the name of the authors were there, and it's very clear it does not necessarily represent the views of the chairman or the commission, but it's really to advance thinking. We thought broadcasters would scream bloody murder. When the paper ended up going out, a funny thing happened. I think it was the next day, John Williams got a call, our engineer, who worked with Evan, the co-author, from a chief engineer from a
unprofitable UHF TV station in Los Angeles saying, how do we apply? Right? And we said, no, this is just, we're going through this analysis, right? But so we didn't, the broadcasters actually, some of them were really interested, although the traditional incumbent broadcasters through their trade association was appalled. But the real
winners.
opposition came from the head of the Cellular Telephone Industry Association, who at the time was a guy named Tom Wheeler, who tried to kill the study because at the same time there was a proceeding at the FCC asking about whether there was sufficient competition in the cellular industry. And, the Carell Williams working paper demonstrated, gee, there probably wasn't. And so the cellular industry tried to kill the study. But Al, who I didn't see, by the way, Tom, a citation to Al in the book. But
Can you add that?
Al,
Yeah.
as chairman, actually was supportive and said, yeah, get it out before somebody stops it. And working with Janice at NTIA, I'm making the case for spectrum auctions. And the work that Evan and John and Charla had done at NTIA, and then with Al, at the FCC, and Tom was there. But it wasn't just this small group. Really, things had begun to change. And so one of the other lessons is that it's absolutely true, and it became absolutely clear, not just theory, but in practice, that government had through all of this Mother May I regulation, had created artificial spectrum scarcity. And the real economic and social benefits of spectrum is to get it into the market, let innovators innovate with it, take risks, sometimes fail, but you have this third type of flexibility that allows the market to self-correct through the transfers of licenses. Last point. I go through this, right, in terms of the lessons learned, and there's a great story here, but one of the things that I've been doing since leaving the FCC, and I'm still working on, is how do you connect the 2 billion, or rather the 4 billion people today on the planet not connected to the internet, notwithstanding the fact that we have cell phones, we have GSM phones, we have 2G. The question is, how do we get more people connected? And predominantly, especially in the developing world, that is going to be through smartphones. And one of the things that we just did, we did a study with the Economist Intelligence Unit, looking at 75 countries, the 46 different indicators, and we came up with something we called the Internet Inclusion Index, looking at the 75 countries. And among the takeaways from that is that even where people are connected, the majority of people who are connected, and there's still half the world that needs to be to the internet, but even a majority of those who are connected are underconnected. And they're underconnected because in order to have the full benefit of the internet through smartphones and other wireless connections, you need 3G or preferably 4G to be able to have that multi-megabit persistent connection to benefit from all those applications. The biggest barrier to that happening, there are several, but one of the 2 or 3 biggest barriers to that happening in the developing world is the lack of spectrum. If you want broadband, you need broadbands, big chunks with a lot of flexibility for the operators to be able to make those decisions, internalize those investment decisions. All too often, in the still the developing world, and Tom talks about this in the book, not necessarily in the context of the developing world, all too often regulators in other parts of the world see spectrum as a broken ATM machine that just spits out cash. And oftentimes it's the communications minister or the telecom regulator that is fighting with the ministers of finance or economy or treasury that wants to generate revenue through creating and maintaining artificial scarcity, not having technology neutrality, not having flexibility, because they want to use spectrum to raise money for the Treasury without understanding that spectrum being used in the economy is actually going to generate way more economic benefits for the society than just sort of nominal tax revenue.
Thank you very much. You know, I have a list of like probably half a dozen follow-up questions I would like to present, but we have about 10 minutes left. Why don't we open up to the audience, and if you have any questions for anyone on our panel. Evan, you've got to have a question.
There's a mic.
Could you state your
Yes.
name? Could you state your name?
Yes, Evan Correll, the FCC. So one of the things that I've been thinking about with property rights was the issue of whether the property right owner should have the right to a specific frequency or the right to a channel in a band. And it turned out that what made the incentive auction work, made competition among broadcasters possible, was the fact that broadcasters did not have the right to a specific frequency, but they had the right to operate in a band, and the FCC was able to have them compete against one another, because if one broadcaster wasn't willing to go, there might be another broadcaster who was, and the first broadcaster could be moved to a lower part of the band. Had the property rights been defined in terms of a specific frequency, then it would have looked like the problem that you have with real estate development, that you needed to actually get every broadcaster within the band, the part of the band that you're trying to repurpose to clear, and you'd be in a bilateral negotiation as opposed to a competitive market, and I didn't really appreciate that. When I thought about the property rights, I thought about the things about flexibility, flexibility of use, flexibility of technology, transferability, all the things that Pepper talked about. But it turned out that when you want to repurpose things using a competitive market mechanism, not having to find the right to a specific frequency was an asset as opposed to a liability. And I just want to know what your views are on that issue.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And there is a logic to mitigating the holdup problems we have. And the TV band is a classic example of a wonderfully productive natural resource where the rights have been assigned willy-nilly, since 1939. We're literally paying for those allocation decisions a long time ago, and so there are rights holders in the band that, for political, regulatory, and other legal reasons, you can't move without paying them off, and sometimes these hold-up problems develop. But I do see the logic of what the FCC did with this, trying to have bidding for generic licenses and not having particular hold-up by particular broadcasters. But there's hold-up on the other side too. The FCC has spent 8 years getting less than a quarter of that band turned around for mobile. Now that's not nothing, and it's an impressive accomplishment, given historical precedent in many ways. But the idea that there's going to be endemic holdup and then that's going to stop, for example, overlays from allocating and reallocating the whole 294 is not shown by what's happened here. In fact, I think that that at least we can agree, going forward with the 35 channels that are still stuck in TV, that there is no incentive auction, there is no statutory authority to go forward except with the overlays. Let me just say, the most successful part of that incentive auction is coming up, and it's coming up because despite your one-on-one holdup negotiations, you have actual identified mobile license holders that are sitting on top of actual identified individual TV stations. And they will make deals, and it will not take 39 months. The FCC has set aside 39 months. That's my prediction, because they have deals, gains from trades that can be made. It's a small numbers bargaining situation. Both sides can come together and make deals. I mean, that's going to happen, is my opinion, and I think that you would agree on that. So there's still a lot of positive dynamic by getting negotiations, even when there's some holdup. By the way, in open market situations, like when you talk about real estate, there are all kinds of transactions that do take place because the buyers, knowing they can be holed up, make differential bids on different parts of the market, and they play in this case, the broadcasters against each other, rather similar to what the FCC did. Now, taking account of holdups is completely appropriate. I know that the FCC has done it, but there has to be some accounting at the end of the day to say, look, there's still a problem getting this spectrum into the highest valued use. The TV allocation table of 1952 is still largely there, and we have to move forward at this point. I don't think that just saying that this generic bidding is going to solve these particular problems, gets the entire answer.
Any other questions? Michael?
Sergeant, I work here at Heritage with James. As you know, there's this kind of infrastructure $1 trillion plan kind of dangling out there, and I view spectrum as kind of incredibly important infrastructure for our wireless and other telecommunications technology. So in our recommendations to the President, to Congress, we include kind of a generic recommendation to increase access to spectrum, to auction off more. But how would you best advise the administration, the FCC, Congress, to best capitalize on this opportunity? Because it has been mentioned that this is out there, both as, I view it more as giving the infrastructure, giving more access to the spectrum as infrastructure itself. But then there's also the fact that it does generate revenues for the federal government. So any advice on kind of the best way to capitalize on that would be great.
Just and actually, I was pleased to see it was reform recommendation number 8 in Professor Hazlett's book. That I think it is about spectrum, but the thing that if you read about what all the carriers are doing right now, it's also about densification of networks and being able to actually deploy very small cells in a lot of different places. And that's actually an infrastructure issue in a large way. And it's the FCC has recognized it. They have an ongoing proceeding. They're looking at ways to do it. Several, states and localities are also recognizing that it's a great way to bring in, more advanced 4G, but also, potentially 5G. So in a way, I agree that spectrum is a component, but in some ways it gets down to like actual infrastructure. So
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's you need both, right? So especially with some of the newer technologies that now, some of the things that we had done at the FCC earlier with authorizing use of 60 gigahertz, the oxygen absorption band, so by design, the signals go very short because oxygen molecules absorb the energy, which means you can reuse. And now the chipsets are available at both low monetary cost, but also low energy cost, energy consumptions, and it's miniaturization. So things can be done today that were theoretical yesterday, but they're actually becoming very practical, and we're working on some of those. But in order to deploy that, you actually need access to have you're using small cell, the small cells have to go someplace, right? And so there are, all kinds of issues that will enable the use of the spectrum in terms of things like siting, access to rights-of-way, public lands and so on, which have to go hand in hand. The other thing, though, about the spectrum I think that's extremely important, and this is not something that's new, it's been over the last several years, the biggest trend in sort of spectrum technology is dynamic sharing of spectrum. Opportunistic use of spectrum using, again, some of these more advanced technologies. And this is one of the things that the Department of Commerce, with its Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, has been looking at, and the new one that's been chartered now for the administration to look at spectrum sharing. Charla, I know, is part of those conversations. The question is, how can more of the spectrum that's being used exclusively by government, for government purposes, how can that be shared for commercial purposes in ways that also continue to protect really mission-critical government uses? In the past, these were sort of mutually exclusive. It's no longer mutually exclusive. Spectrum can be used much more efficiently, with much more flexibility and much more dynamically, if the right rules are in place that allow that to happen. And I agree. The infrastructure, really scaling infrastructure to people, individuals, as well as locations, is going to be spectrum that is going to connect to very, very robust, high-capacity backhaul that's going to be fixed. It could be radio, but a lot of that's going to be fiber, because you need the multi-megabit or gigabit backhaul, because the radios have to be connected to something.
Yeah, no, I do write about some of these ideas in the book, and certainly on the infrastructure front, this walling off scarce frequencies and making the world a more expensive place just doesn't make any sense. Certainly doesn't make any sense, as Bob said, in developing countries where you desperately need this sort of thing. I mean, you look at the Indian market today, and if there's a place that really wants to have the information economy take off and needs broadband, and they're very parsimonious on their spectrum allocations, and they have just stunted the growth of that market for senseless technocratic reasons. So the U.S., obviously, we've done better on some of these things, but I think we still have a long way to go, and certainly turning around some of the fossilized, right structures that do date back generations. That can be done with techniques for liberalization that we have learned, and I just want to guard against making the same mistakes. That is to say, put rights on the market with responsible parties that can reconfigure, bring investment in to help upgrade radios and mitigate the incumbent problems, because they do have some real problems in migrating to other technologies and so forth. But don't create these tragedies of what lawyers call the anti-commons, where you got too many fragmented rights around. We continue to do that in some respects. So I think you want to keep focused not just on the technology and the opportunities that are there to have better radios, but also what the market is going to look like in 5 or 10 or 15 years. Are people going to have to come back to the government to get new rules from regulators, or can they adopt dynamically in the marketplace and make economic deals that make sense in terms of the cooperation that is needed? If I could just take a moment to thank both Charla and Bob for the very generous comments, and of course I've learned a lot from them and from many people in the book that are cited, and certainly Al Sykes should be cited, and I'll have to take a look at that. There's about a third of the book that didn't make it into the final edition, so I know that Al Sykes, I actually was a chairman that I worked for as chief economist, was one of the innovative voices there that I learned a lot from. So anyway, I do appreciate very much, and Jim, I do appreciate you and Heritage having this.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the whole panel for your discussion and thoughts, and your avoidance of the term net neutrality, which was not mentioned once today.
Not a problem.
And thanks to all of you. It's a smaller than average audience, but it's a dedicated group. No one left, even though we ran exceedingly long. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's it.
Thanks.